Hello everyone, my name is Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I'd like to take a moment to appreciate a special class of fictional character. You see, sometimes a certain character comes along in a movie, TV show, or video game that doesn't immediately resonate. You may understand the role they play in the larger story, but you don't always notice the greater meaning behind that character until years later. This is especially true of characters who are just way ahead of their time. Some even seem prophetic in hindsight. In terms of movies that were too ahead of their time, I'd put Megamind right up there with prophetic classics like Idiocracy. It gave us a perfect, comprehensive parody of the superhero movie right before Marvel movies began regularly grossing $1 billion. It's also one of those rare movies that succeeds at subverting expectations in a movie before that ever became a dirty term, especially among Star Wars fans. Seriously, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend you check it out. If you're a fan of superhero movies at all, you'll find plenty to love. Plus, there's the inherent lovability of any character voiced by Will Ferrell. We can't forget that. However, I'm not here to talk about the film's titular character. Fair warning, this character is not voiced by Will Ferrell and isn't anywhere near as lovable. But the role and overall persona of this character is far more relevant today than it was when this movie came out in 2010. That character is the film's true villain, Hal Stewart. And unfortunately, in order to talk about him in terms of the bigger picture, I have to talk about incels. Now believe me when I say this is not a topic I enjoy discussing. The whole incel phenomenon is just one of those issues that brings out the absolute worst in everybody. From people who identify as such to those who call them out. There's just no good way to talk about incels without becoming frustrated with humanity as a whole. And to some extent, talking about incels through Hal Stewart is probably the most balanced way to cover this topic. You see, Hal came along years before this dreaded term ever entered the popular lexicon. That's because by every deplorable measure, Hal Stewart is the best and still the most disturbing portrayal of an incel villain to date. And it's not that hard to make that case. From his first lines to his final confrontation with Megamind, Hal Stewart checks pretty much every box you can imagine for a full-fledged incel. He's socially inept and makes no effort to improve himself. He's obsessed with a woman who never at any point shows any romantic interest in him. He pursues that same woman like a stalker, lying and misleading her in an effort just to be alone with her. He's also narcissistic and entitled, thinking women owe him their affection. He's lazy and lacks ambition, having no real accomplishments. He's irresponsible and selfish, especially after he's given power. He's also angry and violent. He even shows a willingness to kill at some point. And keep in mind, this is all in a DreamWorks movie marketed to kids and young adults. While Hal Stewart never comes off as scary or menacing as Darkseid or Thanos, the way he carries himself throughout the movie reveals some of the most villainous traits you can imagine. Megamind might have started out as a villain in this movie, but at least he had some semblance of self-awareness and was willing to grow. And the more you watch Hal's story play out over the course of the movie, the more you realize just how big an asshole he is. He is not a tragic figure. Unlike Megamind, there's nothing about him that makes him sympathetic in the slightest. You get the sense that even if he didn't get superpowers, he still would have become this angry, bitter, self-entitled asshole. We might not have labeled him as an incel villain at the time, but he now fits that title perfectly. It also makes him a much more menacing villain in retrospect. When you take a step back and watch how Hal conducts himself throughout the course of this movie, the overall impact is very different today than it was when the movie first came out. And it's not just because he fits all the traits of an incel so well. Since this movie came out, real-life atrocities have been committed by self-identified incels. I won't name names. These monsters don't deserve the extra attention. And while every one of these perpetrators was different in some way, they all had a lot in common with Hal. They were bitter, angry, and exceedingly narcissistic. They believed they were entitled to something and the world had denied it to them. They blamed everyone else for their pathetic state and not themselves. They also made no effort to change, nor did they even attempt any introspection. And when they ultimately acted out their anger, innocent people got hurt. In Megamind, Hal Stewart took it to another level. When he was rejected by Roxanne Ritchie, he didn't just stop at lashing out. He was prepared to cause mass destruction and death to an entire city. In terms of villainous motivation, it's malicious and petty to an extreme. This isn't a case where a villain feels like they're justified. Characters like Thanos, Eric Killmonger, and even Lex Luthor to some extent think they're doing what's right. They even believe on some levels that they're serving the greater good with their villainous actions. But there's none of that with Hal. He does what he does out of selfishness, ego, and hatred. Whereas Megamind makes an effort to redeem himself for all his misdeeds, Hal never even apologizes. He shows no remorse or guilt. You get the sense that even after he's defeated, he's learned nothing. He may not be pure evil in the classic Disney sense, but I would argue that actually makes him even worse. The incel phenomenon is a festering wound in our social climate. It's one of those things that I doubt we've seen the last of. There will likely be other crimes committed by self-described incels, and innocent people, especially women, will suffer because of it. That only serves to make Hal Stewart a much more terrifying villain in hindsight. And when a character is less redeemable than nearly every Marvel or DC villain in existence, that's when you know you've reached a special level of evil. And if you don't believe me, again, I encourage you to check Megamind out. Even though this movie is a decade old, it still managed to create a villain who's only gotten more evil with time. In a sense, Hal Stewart was still ahead of his time, albeit in the worst possible way. In terms of incel villains, he sets a disturbingly high bar, one that nobody in any world, fictional or otherwise, should try to emulate. Megamind is still a great movie. The fact it has an incel villain doesn't detract from its greatness. But in terms of how we measure true villainy, it offers some profound insights. And it's still funny. Will Ferrell's charm is simply greater than any incel villain. That much we can take comfort in. Thanks for watching, everybody, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and stay safe.